I've just read a horror story about window coverings. I shudder at the very thought of it. Well, it's October now, officially the spooky season, as you can see. Of course, y'all know we observe spooky season all year round here, but these are the times when even the normal people seem to like a good horror story, so what better time than the present to talk about some books? As usual, I'll be reviewing all the books I read last month, so in this case, these are the ones I read in September of 2025. Admittedly, this is going to be a shorter one than usual. I only managed to get through a few books this month, partly because I've just been so busy working on everything else that's going on, all of my other projects, and partly because one of them really was a true beast of a book and it just took me that long to finish it. But as always, if you happen to be interested, either in that one or in any of these other books, I've put purchase links for you right down there in the What's It, so you can get copies for yourself while also supporting my work here on this channel, which is, of course, very much appreciated. My other sort of confession to get out of the way right here at the start is that only about half of this month's books are actually horror or horror related. That's just how it came out this time, but I do still have some great stuff lined up, and I should have a much more horror-centric October, so stay tuned for that. But with all of that out of the way, let's get right to the books, shall we? First up actually is a horror book, fortunately, and it's The Pickman Papers, edited by R. Poyton. This is an anthology of Lovecraftian or Lovecraft-inspired horror stories, but it's a bit different from your ordinary anthologies in that all of these are written as if they were speeches given at a meeting of the Pickman Club, a sort of society of distinguished gentlemen who meet to share their research and experiences in strange and unusual phenomena. Think of it sort of like the Chowder Society from Ghost Story, but in a more Lovecraftian sense. But this being a set of horror stories, one gets the impression that their research often gets these so-called Pickmanites into not only bizarre situations, but downright terrifying ones. In that way, it ends up reading as a sort of a cross between Lovecraftian fiction and almost Sherlock Holmesian mystery. For me, that's just what the doctor ordered. As much as I love a good horror story, any good horror story will do, I do also have a soft spot for cross-genre works, and while these do all skew heavily toward the horror side, they also all have that little flavor of mystery, perhaps certain hints of antiquarianism, and a sort of je ne sais quoi that makes them a true delight to read. As will inevitably be the case with any multi-author anthology, some of the stories are stronger than others. But I have to say, I was pleasantly surprised in this case to find that I couldn't find even one that didn't work for me on at least some level. That's a rare accomplishment. There are 3 or 4 that really stood out as exemplary, but all the rest are still a pleasure to read. There are no real weak links in this book. Illustrations accompanying the title page of each of the stories adds that extra little touch that makes this one of the better anthologies I've happened across in recent years. Next up was one of my non-horror reads. If you've been watching these videos for a few months, you know that I've been working my way through Dennis Prager's commentary on the Torah. And so this month, I finished up the series with his discussion of Deuteronomy, part of his Rational Bible series. This was the last of the books in this series I read, or at least so far. We still await the hopefully soon, hopefully eventual publication of Dennis Prager's Leviticus. Anyway, that I stuck with the series all the way through ought itself to indicate that I found it good, high quality, and useful. And indeed, I have thought exactly that about the entire series, this last volume included. Most of my thoughts here, in fact, mirror the exact same things I've said about the other volumes in the series. Among those thoughts about the series as a whole were an appreciation for the line-by-line explanation of even some of the most difficult verses, gladness at the opportunity to read Prager's Jewish perspective on the first 5 books of the Bible, which is almost but not entirely the same as the Christian perspective I grew up learning about, and admiration for the way the author applied ancient biblical wisdom to modern-day social issues in several places throughout the books. The main thing, on the other hand, I've criticized throughout the series has been the repetitiveness of the work. Because the Bible itself sometimes repeats, and then because I read these commentaries straight through, I did find myself feeling that certain passages were fairly redundant because the same ideas, not all of the same ideas, but some of the same ideas kept coming up time and again throughout the books. The only other minor criticism I think some readers would perhaps object to in the series as a whole has been that I felt like Christian readers might feel like Prager's Jewish read of the Bible omits certain details important to their own theology. Which makes sense. Prager is Jewish, so of course it's from a Jewish perspective, although he is explicitly writing for Jews, Christians, and non-religious people. So I've mentioned in a couple of places in the other books that I thought he missed an opportunity to comment on the differences between these various faiths. Well, anyway, getting to this one, most of my thoughts here in Deuteronomy have been the same, but with a few extra pluses and minuses added. On that topic of Christian commentary, I have a lot of respect for Prager because he did, in fact, in this volume, include those brief discussions of several points of Christian theology, even though these are not his own beliefs. He did hear exactly what I was sort of suggesting from some of the other volumes. That helps make the book a lot more useful for readers who are either Christians themselves or who are looking for a more complete and universal commentary. However, though I didn't find this book any more repetitive than the other volumes, having read it shortly after the others, I did find that it was still equally repetitive, and because I had been reading these in series, I found the repetitiveness started to get to me a little bit more with each volume. That's a minor criticism, though. And with those criticisms aside, though this is not the absolute deepest discussion of the meaning and implications of the Mosaic law in the world, this is easily among the best for balancing completeness with accessibility to a wide range of readers. Indeed, I think Prager's commentary here on the 10 Commandments, or the 10 Statements, might even surpass his already strong commentary on the same in the Exodus book. And so it's well worth reading, even just for that alone. This is therefore highly recommended for anyone setting out to study the Jewish or the Christian scriptures. But since I've now finished the series until Dennis recovers from his injury sufficiently to finish Leviticus, and we all hope that day is coming, this will have to be my final word on the subject for quite a while. Next up, I should mention another horror-related title, although it's one I can't in good conscience actually review, because that book is my own latest, the 3rd volume in my Case Files of the Rocky Mountain Paranormal Research Society series. If you're curious about all the details before you order a copy, and I certainly hope you order a copy, I made a whole video about just this book, and I would recommend watching that. I sort of went chapter by chapter through the whole table of contents so you know what you're getting. But the reason I mention it again here, other than to simply remind you about it as many times as I can, because I'm not a wealthy man and every book sale counts, the other reason is that I intend these videos to be a complete, or at least nearly complete, record of what I've been reading. And obviously I didn't read this only the one time in September. I wrote it and then read it again and again and again as I was editing and preparing for publication. But since September was the month it came out, this is the video in which I'm including it. I really am quite proud of this one. I think it's a good one, and I hope you're going to like it, and so I hope you all give it a chance. Obviously, I've put links down in the What's It where you can find it on Amazon. You can get ebooks, paperbacks, or autographed copies from the various links that I have put for you. The next one is my other non-horror one. I did save one more horror novel for the last one, so be sure to stay tuned for that. But the next one that I read was the one that I mentioned being particularly long. And I wasn't kidding because, as you can see, it's a big one. The book was the Norton Anthology of Poetry. This is the 6th edition, that's the most current one, which ends up coming in at something like 2,500 pages. So it's a long book. This review will necessarily be brief because it's hard to properly review something that's intentionally so broad and encyclopedic as this. It's meant to be a cross-section of all of English language poetry, going all the way back even to Old English, Anglo-Saxon language, although with, of course, a greater emphasis on more modern works in more modern English. With that in mind, there are going to be a lot of things any reader will love, and a lot of things any reader will dislike. The purpose isn't for every poem to be everyone's cup of tea, but simply to provide the reader with one of the largest and most complete collections of English verse in the world. And it succeeds in that admirably. Where I think I can offer some words by way of review and criticism has to do a little bit with the curation of the poems and even more to do with the layout of the book. I was disappointed to find a lot of my personal favorites, in terms of poets or poems, had indeed been omitted, including some which were included in prior editions of the same anthology. So, while this most recent version is absolutely the one to get if you want to read the latest poems, and there are some very new ones included, readers might also want to check the table of contents of each edition if there are any specific poems or poets you're hoping to have in your own copy. Beyond that, I do question the inclusion of some of what I consider to be very inferior poems at the expense of what I consider to be some true classics, but that is admittedly a matter of personal preference. Where I have a more objective criticism has to do with the layout. The poems are arranged by author or by poet, and the poets are arranged by date of birth. On some level, that's as good a way of laying out the book as any. Arranging by publication date, for instance, would have necessitated flipping back and forth between the poets rather than grouping all of a given author's works together. Fair enough. However, this layout does make it difficult to find poems the reader might be looking for. It would have benefited greatly from indices cross-referencing the poems by poetic style or structure, by subject matter, and indeed by date of publication. Nevertheless, despite a few complaints, this has already become a new favorite resource, which I will keep readily at hand. Though I did read it cover to cover, that's not really what it's meant for, and not really how I would recommend to approach it. It's meant to be a long-term companion, something you can keep on your desk, and something to which you can turn for mental enrichment whenever you feel in a poetic sort of mood. Finally, we return to our favorite genre with Slewfoot by Brom, which was one of the selections my book club is reading this spooky season. Now, this is an interesting book. It's a tale about a young woman trying to navigate life in Puritan New England, while dealing with a greedy family member who's after her farm. And of course, being a supernatural novel, we also quickly realize there's a supernatural beast of some sort lurking in the woods outside the village. But we're not immediately sure whether it's the devil himself, as the Puritans might suspect, or something else entirely. The first thing I'll say about this book is that it's beautifully produced, including several full-color paintings by the author himself. So if you do choose to read this one, be sure to read it in print so that you get the whole experience. I always encourage people to go for print anyway, but especially when there are artworks included, ebooks and audiobooks simply won't get the job done. In terms of the story itself, I'll admit I struggled to get into it for the first couple of chapters. I found myself much more interested in the entirely natural human drama between the main character and the Puritan villagers and that cruel family member than I did in the supernatural elements that were interspersed throughout those pages, and which I think we were supposed to find the more interesting part. However, as the book moves forward, I found myself getting much more into both elements, and I thought it did a great job of blending the natural and the supernatural by the end. It was also fascinating to see how it managed to compare and contrast puritanical Christian doctrine with a sort of, what would you say, neo-pagan woodland mythology in some really interesting ways. A lot of that doesn't really come to the fore until closer to the end of the book, and I don't want to spoil anything, so I need to tread really lightly here in terms of what I can and can't say. But let's just say if you're interested in comparative religions or comparative mythologies, it might be right up your alley. And a lot of credit to the author for treating everyone with due respect. I could easily imagine a lesser book might have either portrayed the pagan side as purely evil and satanic, or the Puritans as dim-witted and cruel, as far too many horror novels about the Puritans have done, especially in recent years. Instead, this book gives us a more rounded and balanced treatment of each, with seemingly heroic and seemingly villainous characters on both sides, and sometimes we're not sure who's who actually in terms of the heroes and the villains. And so the reader struggles along with the characters to make sense of it all right up until the end. On the topic of the ending itself, I do take some issue with certain elements of the ending, which I can't give away. That would be major spoilers. But let's just say that though I found the ending satisfactory in terms of narrative structure, something about it, and I can put my finger on what it was, but I can't say because it would be a spoiler, but something about it just didn't quite land the way I wanted it to. Though marketed as true horror, I would consider this at least as much dark fantasy as I would horror. But while I may not have found it frightening in the slightest, and I don't know whether that's because it's more fantasy than horror or because I'm just desensitized and all but impossible to frighten in a work of literature. Regardless of that, I do think it would make a great read for the spooky Halloween season. So I think my book club picked a good one for our Halloween reading, and if you're looking for something to read for yourself this October, this would be a strong contender. And, well, that brings us to the end of another review video, and so, alas, to the end of our time together on this frightfully early morning for me, and whatever time it might be for you. Obviously, this was shorter than sometimes, but never to fear, I have already started my October reading. I seem to be progressing through the books a little bit faster this month already, even though we're only a couple days in. And I should be back on track to bring you a lot more books and a lot more horror next month. Do be sure to subscribe and ring that bell so you don't miss it. While you're at it, I'd also appreciate your thumbs up, your comments, and if you were to share this and all of my videos all around your social medias and with all your friends, family, acquaintances, enemies, coworkers, whoever you might share this with, because I am desperately trying to grow my audience. All much appreciated. But in the meantime, take care and stay scared.